A team of scientists spent years pulling blood samples from villages, cities, and remote settlements on every continent on Earth, farming communities in West Africa, fishing towns in Scandinavia, mountain villages in the Andes, desert tribes in the Middle East, island populations scattered across the Pacific. They tested each sample for blood type, mapped the results onto a global chart, and then laid that chart next to something nobody expected to matter: a map of the deadliest diseases in human history. What they found lined up so closely that some of the researchers thought they had made a mistake. They hadn't. The pattern was real, and it rewrote what we thought we knew about something as simple as whether your blood is type A, B, AB, or O. If you're enjoying deep dives like this, subscribe, because we break down discoveries like this every week. Now let's get into what the data actually showed. The project itself took years to put together. Blood samples are not hard to collect in a hospital, but collecting them from isolated communities on every continent with proper consent, proper storage, and reliable lab testing is a massive undertaking. Researchers worked with local health workers and universities in dozens of countries, cross-checking each result against older blood bank records that stretched back decades in some regions and barely existed in others. Where modern records were thin, scientists turned to something unexpected: skeletal remains. Ancient bone and tooth fragments still carry enough genetic material in some cases to determine blood type, which let researchers compare populations from centuries or even thousands of years ago against the people living in those same regions today. That comparison turned out to be one of the most important parts of the whole study because it showed how much blood type frequencies have shifted, or in some cases barely shifted at all, over long stretches of human history. Blood type feels like one of those small, almost meaningless facts about your body. You learn it once, maybe on a hospital form, and you forget it. But blood type is not random. It is written into your DNA, passed down from your parents, and shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. And for a long time, scientists had no clear answer for why one part of the world is dominated by type O blood, while another region has unusually high rates of type B, or why type A shows up more often in some populations than others. The old assumption was that blood type distribution was mostly random noise, a side effect of genetic drift as small groups of humans spread out and settled in different places. Genetic drift is real. Small founding populations often carry only a slice of the genetic variety of the larger group they came from, and that alone can shift the numbers in one direction or another. But when researchers compared blood type maps against centuries of disease records, they found something that drift alone could not explain. The regions hit hardest by specific diseases. Throughout history were the same regions where certain blood types became dominant or nearly disappeared. That is not the fingerprint of random chance. That is the fingerprint of survival. To understand why, you have to understand what blood type actually is. Your blood type is determined by tiny molecules called antigens that sit on the surface of your red blood cells. Type A blood has A antigens, type B has B antigens, type AB has both, type O has neither. These antigens do more than just determine whether you can donate blood to your neighbor. They are one of the first things a pathogen encounters when it enters your bloodstream, and it turns out that different antigens interact with different diseases in very different ways. Take malaria, one of the oldest and deadliest diseases in human history. For thousands of years, malaria has killed more humans than almost any other single cause of death, and it still kills hundreds of thousands of people every year, mostly in tropical regions. Researchers studying malaria noticed something strange decades ago. People with type O blood tend to experience milder cases of the most severe form of malaria compared to people with type A, B, or AB blood. The reason has to do with how infected red blood cells stick together inside the bloodstream. In people with type A or B blood, infected cells clump more easily, which can block small blood vessels and lead to the most dangerous complications. In people with type O blood, that clumping happens less, which seems to reduce the odds of the infection turning deadly. Now look at where type O blood is most common. Large parts of Central and South America, particularly among indigenous populations, show extremely high rates of type O blood, in some communities close to 100%. Parts of West Africa also show elevated rates of type O. These are regions that have dealt with malaria for an enormous stretch of human history. The correlation does not prove that malaria alone created these patterns, but it lines up closely enough that researchers now treat malaria as one of the strongest evolutionary pressures shaping blood type frequency across large parts of the globe. Malaria itself is not one single disease. There are several different species of the parasite that causes it, and each one interacts with the human body differently. One of the most striking discoveries in this field came from a completely separate blood marker called the Duffy antigen, which is closely studied alongside the ABO blood group. A large majority of people with West African ancestry lack this Duffy antigen entirely. which makes them almost completely resistant to one particular species of malaria that relies on that antigen to enter red blood cells. Researchers believe this resistance spread rapidly through West African populations because it offered such an enormous survival advantage that it became one of the fastest examples of natural selection ever documented in humans. Once scientists started laying these disease maps over blood type maps region by region, a bigger picture began to form. Blood type is not just a random trait that happened to end up unevenly distributed around the world. It looks like a living record of the diseases that have shaped a population over thousands of years. Every region on Earth has faced a different combination of deadly pathogens throughout its history, and the blood type profile of the people living there today reflects which combinations of antigens gave their ancestors the best odds of surviving long enough to have children. This idea connects to something researchers already understood about human genetics more broadly. Small pioneering groups that migrated out of one region into a new one carried only a portion of the genetic diversity of their original population. As those groups settled into new environments and encountered new diseases, natural selection pushed their genetics in whatever direction improved survival against local threats. Over enough generations, even a trait as basic as blood type can shift dramatically from one region to the next, not because of random chance, but because disease acted as a filter, generation after generation, quietly deciding who lived long enough to pass on their genes. This helps explain some of the more unusual blood type patterns found around the world. Type B blood, for example, shows some of its highest frequencies across parts of Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent, regions with their own unique and complicated disease histories, including repeated waves of plague and various strains of dysentery and other bacterial infections that may have interacted differently with each blood type. Meanwhile, type AB blood, the rarest blood type globally, appears at its highest frequencies in parts of Asia, a pattern researchers believe reflects a long history of population mixing between groups that originally carried type A and type B blood at different rates. Rh factor, the positive or negative marker attached to blood type, follows its own separate and fascinating pattern. Rh negative blood is unusually rare across most of the world, but shows up at strikingly high frequencies in one specific population: the Basque people of northern Spain and southwestern France. Researchers have studied this population for decades because their genetics, including their blood type patterns, look distinct from surrounding European populations in ways that suggest a long period of relative isolation, possibly stretching back tens of thousands of years. The disease pressures and evolutionary path that shaped Rh frequency in this region are still being studied, but the extreme concentration found in one relatively small, geographically defined population is exactly the kind of pattern you would expect from a group that experienced a very specific evolutionary history separate from its neighbors. There's another twist to the Rh story that researchers only pieced together in recent decades. When a mother with Rh negative blood carries a baby with Rh positive blood, her immune system can sometimes react to the baby's blood as if it were a threat, which can cause serious complications in later pregnancies if left untreated. For most of human history, there was no way to prevent this, which means Rh negative mothers, in populations where Rh positive blood was common, would have faced real reproductive risk, generation after generation. Some researchers believe this may have quietly shaped Rh frequency in certain regions over long stretches of time, favoring whichever combination of Rh types caused the fewest pregnancy complications in a given population. It is a striking example of how a survival pressure does not always come from an outside pathogen. Sometimes it comes from something as intimate as the biological relationship between a mother and her own child. Scientists also found unexpected blood type patterns among populations that migrated across oceans rather than continents. Pacific Island populations, descended from seafarers who crossed enormous stretches of open water in outrigger canoes centuries before European sailors mapped the same routes, show blood type frequencies that differ sharply from the mainland Asian populations most closely related to them by ancestry. Researchers suspect that the small size of the founding groups who first settled these islands, combined with the unique disease environment of tropical island life, pushed blood type frequencies in a direction found almost nowhere else on Earth. Isolated island populations, cut off from the disease exposure of larger continents for centuries at a time, sometimes show blood type profiles that look almost frozen in place compared to their mainland relatives, offering researchers a kind of genetic time capsule. None of this means your blood type determines your fate if you catch a particular illness today. Modern medicine, vaccines, clean water systems, and antibiotics have changed the equation completely. A person with type O blood today, facing a mild case of malaria in a country with access to treatment, is in an entirely different situation than someone facing the same infection 1,000 years ago with no modern medicine available. The evolutionary pressures that shaped these blood type patterns played out over thousands of years, long before any of the medical tools we rely on today existed. What the data shows is not a warning about your personal risk today. It is a record of what happened to entire populations over an almost unimaginable stretch of time. This is also not evidence for any kind of ranking between populations. A region with a high rate of type O blood is not biologically superior or inferior to a region with a high rate of type B blood. Each pattern reflects a different, equally valid evolutionary response to a different set of local threats. A population that developed high rates of type O blood in response to malaria faced a completely different survival challenge than a population that developed high rates of type B blood in response to cholera or plague. There is no universal best blood type. There is only the blood type that happened to offer the strongest odds of survival against whatever disease was most dangerous in that specific place at that specific time in history. What makes this research genuinely remarkable is how it turns something as ordinary as a blood type card into a window into deep human history. Every time someone finds out their blood type, they are looking at a small piece of evidence shaped by ancestors they will never meet, who survived outbreaks with no names for the diseases they were fighting and no understanding of antigens or antibodies. They simply lived, or they didn't, and the ones who lived passed something forward. Multiply that story across thousands of generations and millions of people, and you get the blood type map scientists are studying today. Researchers are still working to untangle exactly how much of the global blood type pattern comes from disease resistance versus other factors like random genetic drift, population bottlenecks, and simple migration history. Not every regional blood type pattern has a clean disease explanation yet, and scientists are careful not to overstate connections that are still being tested. But the overall trend, the fact that regions with a long history of specific deadly diseases tend to show blood type frequencies that would have offered some survival advantage against those exact diseases, has held up across study after study, in population after population, on continent after continent. It also raises a bigger question about what other invisible traits inside our bodies might be quietly shaped the same way. Blood type is easy to study because it is simple to test and has been recorded for over a century in hospitals and blood banks around the world. But if something as basic as antigens on a red blood cell can carry the fingerprint of ancient disease, it raises the possibility that other traits we consider minor or irrelevant might also be carrying stories we have not uncovered yet, written into our genes by pathogens that stopped being a threat centuries or even thousands of years ago. This research also changes the way some doctors think about blood type in modern medicine. For years, blood type was treated purely as a matter of transfusion safety, something that mattered only if you needed surgery or ended up in an emergency room. Newer studies have started looking at whether blood type plays a small role in modern conditions as well, including certain patterns in heart disease risk, blood clotting, and how the body responds to some modern viral infections. The effects researchers have found so far are generally small compared to lifestyle factors like diet, exercise, and access to health care, and blood type should never be treated as a substitute for actual medical advice or testing. But the fact that researchers are even asking these questions shows how far the science has come from the old idea that blood type is nothing more than a label on a hospital chart. What ties all of this together is a simple but powerful idea. Every population on Earth has been shaped by a unique combination of environment, migration, and disease, and none of those combinations are identical. A community that spent thousands of years fighting malaria developed a different genetic profile than a community that spent those same thousands of years fighting cholera, or plague, or smallpox, or some combination none of us have even identified yet. Blood type is simply one of the clearest, most measurable places where that history shows up. It did not require complicated genome sequencing to discover. Doctors have been recording blood type on paper charts for over 100 years, all over the world, which means this evidence was sitting in plain sight the entire time, waiting for someone to lay the right two maps side by side. For now, the blood type research stands as one of the clearest examples of how deeply connected human biology is to human history. The disease outbreaks that terrified our ancestors, the plagues that emptied villages, the epidemics that spread along trade routes and rivers, none of them disappeared without a trace. They left their mark in the DNA of everyone who survived them, encoded in something as small and as ordinary as the letter on a blood type card. Every A, B, AB, and O carries a piece of that story, a quiet record of battles fought long before anyone alive today was born, and won by the ancestors who made it possible for you to be here at all.